Well, good afternoon. It's the longest second or two on the planet when you hit that start stream button and then it finally starts. I just want to welcome you here to our Fearless Artist Community live session. As you know, members of my Fearless Artist community have access to these live broadcasts. I do them almost every week here in our Fearless Artist community. The goal here is to encourage and inspire you as you become your own favorite artist. And I wanted to kick off a brand new series this week that is going to be, I think, eventually a complete course. And as Fearless Artist community members, you get access to that course. Right now, you get to test out the content and let me know if it works for you. So thanks for being my guinea pigs today. No offense to guinea pigs. We are going to, and I don't know that we should even use that analogy anymore. I don't know what we test things on anymore. We're not testing on guinea pigs. No animals were harmed in this broadcast. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my recording. I think I can fix that by pressing a button over here. And hopefully it's not too choppy, because YouTube's giving me a bit of an error. Okay, so hopefully that makes it better. Let me know if it's still buffering and acting a little bit glitchy, because I want a nice smooth broadcast, and we'll try to tweak it until we get there. The rain just rolled in and there's thunder happening too, so I'm really hoping we don't lose power, that lightning behaves itself and doesn't take out any power transformers. So we'll just play it by ear and do the best we can. Okay, so we're starting a brand new video series today. I'm titling it right now, working title, Learning to See Like an Artist, because I know that as artists, when we start painting, we start seeing the world in new ways. We start looking at the world and matching it to the colors of paint in our palette. We start looking at everything and thinking, how would I paint that? And we find that it can actually be ridiculously difficult to translate our 3D space into the flat medium of watercolor paper. We have to translate, and that's our job as communicators in art, is to figure out what we want to say and how to share it, sharing it in our way. And we are generally visually oriented. There's something that inspires us to paint, and then we find our way to paint it in our own way, whether it's super realistic or loose and fluid. You know my preference, and so there's a little miscommunication that happens, I think, often when we start painting. And when I first started painting, I really struggled with it. I would hear artists in the art books that I was buying, in the magazines I was reading, they would say things like, you have to learn how to draw in order to be able to create strong paintings. If your drawing is bad, your painting will be bad. And I was not a drawer. I've tried to draw. I spent a lot of time as a teenager using my pencil to sketch the things that were around me. My sister was a very willing audience member or portrait sitter for me. And but I struggled. I was just not consistent. I didn't have the skills and I didn't really enjoy it. I really didn't feel an affinity with my pencil. And so at a certain point, I just kind of let go of any idea that I could draw accurately. And I just decided to launch straight into painting. And after a few years, I noticed that my drawing skills had improved. Even though I wasn't using a pencil, my drawing skills were better because I had learned to draw with my paintbrush. So when I talk about drawing, please know that I do not mean drawing outlines with your pencil. That's why I want to call this course Learning to See Like an Artist, because then it doesn't really matter what tool you use to get what you're seeing down, capture it on paper. But you're still drawing. You're seeing, you're translating, you're capturing it on paper. So the other thing that I found that was difficult for me was that when I would draw with a pencil, I was working in outlines, contour drawings, drawing the shapes of what I saw, drawing the details that I saw and trying to shade them in. And then if I were to then go and do a painting from that drawing, it was almost like starting over, because the process of drawing with a pencil was very different than the process of painting that same thing with my brush. So I realized that in learning to see like an artist, I could simplify my scene. I could capture shape and value, and it didn't really matter what medium I was using. if my process for recognizing what I was seeing and getting it down on paper was consistent. So I'm hoping that encourages you as you think about learning to see. This is something you can train yourself to do. This is something you can train yourself to do. And this is something that you will actually learn to do as you paint. Just like that first time that we give a 3-year-old a crayon or a pencil and teach them how to form the letters of their name, what they start out by doing often bears very little resemblance to what it actually should look like. To what it actually should look like. Their S's might be backwards, they might write upside down and backwards, and everything's large and sprawling or different sizes. They're not consistent. And yet they develop the skills to be able to confidently and competently write the letters of the alphabet and form them into all kinds of words as they grow. And so we can do the same as we pick up our tool and work to translate what we see and get it down on paper. We're learning to see and we're learning to draw. Excuse me. Just bear with me for a second while I clear my throat here. Okay, what you're seeing here, as Kathy comments that I don't draw, is a drawing that I'm working on right now. And my reference photo for it. And as you can see, I'm zooming in a bit. It's very detailed. Now let me show you the paintings that I've done before I started this drawing. I put them somewhere around here. I'm not sure which one I should show you first. I had a little sketch that I started. I'm eating spoonfuls of honey right now to keep to soothe my throat. It seems like it works better than a cough drop. I have a little tickle. And then I did a value study. And this was done in watercolor graphite. And then I did a painted version. And I wasn't 100% happy with it. Now, this was a challenge for me because in this scene, we've got a lot of man-made shapes. And I don't paint man-made stuff very often. And we've got signage that spells words. And so there is a feeling of needing accuracy in order to paint this. Now, painting it without sketching gave me the freedom to see if this is something I can do. Can you paint signage and all those man-made shapes and still have a loose approach? And if your observation skills are good, I really believe that this is possible. And there are parts of this painting that I really like. But at the same time, I also thought, what would it be like for me if I could draw this accurately in pencil and have maybe a foundational drawing, just like this, that I could then use and trace very small amounts of it. So the main shapes, hints of the letter shapes so that they are approximately in the right place, and then did loose watercolor over top. So that's going to be my process over the next few weeks. I'm still working on the drawing because it's been a really kind of fun and exciting challenge for me to see how my drawing skills have grown, even though I haven't picked up a pencil to draw in any kind of detail in years and years. And you know what I'm seeing is that because I've grown as an artist even though I'm using a brush and not a pencil, I have grown in my ability to depict my scene accurately. And I'm very pleased with how this is going so far. And it's just kind of a reminder and a reinforcement that that my observation skills that can make any painting or drawing stronger, they're improving as I paint in watercolor, even if I'm not choosing a realistic approach. And that's been exciting to see. Okay, let's just take a switch back here. Looking back to my notes here, that little coughing spell knocked me a little bit crooked here, so I'm trying to get back to my goal for today for our lesson. Okay, so like I said, it used to intimidate me to feel like I needed to have drawing skills in order to paint. So let's redefine drawing. Let's, instead of thinking about getting your pencil and creating an accurate, detailed, realistic sketch, drawing outlines, drawing shapes, let's think about drawing as being able to place objects in the right position on the picture plane. Getting that sign the right proportions was the first step. Before I ever started writing those letters, it's having an ability to see shape and value in order to capture your subject. And we want to recognize that everything is a shape. We can simplify anything we see down to those basic foundational shapes. These common drawing strategies are universal. And so as we learn to simplify, that's why my drawing skills are getting better. I've learned to simplify. I've learned to be able to see proportion by comparing objects to other objects. And so that's made it easier for me to be able to draw accurately and to be able to paint without drawing first, to get my scene down without that first pencil sketch to position everything. It's exciting to see that happen, and it's built my skills. I'm going to show you that in a minute. A problem with drawing, this is what often happens for us, as you're painting, and you may have noticed this for yourself, often we get hung up on the labels or the names of what we're creating. So what's a good example? Say you see a scene, well actually a really good example is from my reference photo. Let's see if I can share that with you. It's going to take me a second. Oh, no, it's not. It's right there. Okay, so this is my reference photo. Now we've got the Frontier Motel and Restaurant sign, and they're all three long, narrow, rectangular shapes. But that cafe sign underneath is on the side of the building. Can you see it there? It is a rectangular shape, right? We know it's a sign. We can tell that it's nailed to the side of the building. And so we've put a label on it. We've thought that's a sign, it's rectangular. But actually, because that sign is sloping away from us, the shape and size of that rectangle we often draw it wrong. We would often draw it wider than it is because in our mind, we're walking around the building and looking at it head on. We actually move around our scene, and so often we fail to notice distortions of shape, things like that, because we have a name for something and we have an idea of what it should look like or what it would look like if we were standing there looking at it, rather than just isolating that object in the scene and studying it based on what it exactly looks like in our reference photo. We often use X-ray vision when we paint. If we've got, and I wonder if it's, excuse me, I don't know if we have an example here in my reference photo, but often we would see, perhaps you have a mountain in your painting and there's, well actually, oh, here we go. We do have a mountain. This is a reference photo I have sitting here on my work surface, and you can see this is Spirit Island in Malign Lake near Jasper, Canada. Jasper National Park, beautiful place. And these trees on that little island, it's not really an island, it's a little spit of land, they're in front of the mountains that are behind them. And often when we go to paint a subject like this, we would paint that mountain range as though the trees weren't there, let it dry, and then come back and put the trees in front of it. And then suddenly there's an outline of the mountain showing through. So we often try to see through objects to the object behind. Rather than looking at this as a two-dimensional photograph, we look at it as though we were standing in that location. And so we fill in extra information that really our drawing doesn't need. When we know an object has, when we have an object that's behind another object, we tend to try to paint the parts we can't see because our brains know they're there. We fail to see perspective, changing the size of things. Foreshortening, of course, we know that my hand is not larger than my head, but if I get up close to the camera, to the viewer, suddenly my hand is much larger than my head. Hello. And so we fail to recognize that, and we try to paint something the size that we think it should be rather than the size that it actually is. That's why sometimes when we're painting people in a scene, we paint them too big for the distance that they're supposed to be for the viewer. Because they're important to us, we make them larger, and next thing you know, our perspective is all off. We want to learn how to abstract what we see, to take it at face value without putting in that subtext of that additional knowledge that we think we have about the subject. I like to kind of detach my thinking brain from my observing eye in a way, so that my brain isn't trying to explain what I see. My eye is telling my brain what it sees. And we have some tools that we can use to help us with this. So let's take a look at those tools over here on my work surface. We are going to talk more about, whoops, that's the wrong button. Work surface, there we go. We are going to talk more about perspective during this course, so be patient with me. Okay, so what you're seeing in front of you, on your screen, is my overlays. This is a clear, it says acetate alternative. It's really just a clear acetate or clear plastic film. If you go to a print shop, you could ask them for transparency sheets and they would give you something very similar to this. This is just a special artist one that really isn't necessary for what we're going to be using it for. I like to use these overlays for helping me to understand what I'm seeing. Sometimes we need to work with proportion. And if you struggle with proportion, one way that you can help to get everything the right size is I just created this grid with my acetate film. There, now you can see it. This is a 1 inch by 1 inch grid, so they're pretty small squares. But one of the easiest ways, one of the most reliable ways, I guess, to get an accurate drawing would be to use a grid. I can place this over my reference photo, and that helps me to see where everything is in relation to everything else and what size it is. So I can see that my trees are approximately 2 squares high, whereas this tree stump is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares high. So suddenly I have some scale to work with. I can also isolate color and isolate shape by looking inside one square. And have you ever seen those art projects where everybody's given a color and a square to paint, and they take all those paintings and make a massive painting? Actually, Sandrine Pelsier is doing it with the Big Picture Art Project. You can create, and we do it with digital photos. They're made up of pixels, which are tiny little squares, and they're so small we can't see them unless you zoom in really close. And so everything, but for our sake, this really can help you to identify the size of objects, to identify color, to see those shapes in relation. This is going to result in a rigid drawing. So it is something you can, and what you can do is, it can also help you scale your drawing. These are 1 inch squares, but if I had another grid with 1.5 inch squares and drew everything to fill in those 1.5 inch squares, I'd have increased my drawing exponentially. And so it is a good way to accurately scale your painting. But I like to use it more just as a reference to help me understand the size of the objects I'm looking at and their placement in the scene. And it doesn't have to be a 1 inch grid. I'm going to show you another one. This is a grid that I've divided in thirds. And because my photo is not the same size as my grid, it's not actually going to be very accurate. And so that's just going to have to be what it is. You can see my photo is more like 4.5 square, or 6.5, 4.5 squares. Something, I don't know. But we can use this to help us, again, see where everything kind of falls in the painting and where it should go. If we want to adjust our trees so that they're more where these points converge, which is the rule of thirds. I feel like I'm not explaining this well. But we're going to cover it again. This isn't the only time. In your photo, and this photo is an example, the things that fall in those convergent points, if I had properly divided my reference photo into thirds, and thirds here, where these points converge are the most pleasing places to put your focal point. And so we'd probably find that this tree and maybe this rock even create a point of impact, and maybe the point of a mountain we want to have in this corner where that focal area is. And we can adjust our elements in our scene to fall in those thirds, and this helps us to divide up our scene. I always find that dividing things up a little bit just helps me to put it into manageable chunks as I sketch. Now the other thing I have is my light tablet, and I probably, well, let me see, I don't always use it for sketching, but it can again help you to understand your scene. I haven't plugged it in, I'm not going to actually use it today. It has 3 light settings, and it makes it so that I can trace maybe a printed photo, and I have the original, this guy. This is photo paper. It's a little bit thick, and so the light tablet isn't going to like it very much, but a picture like this that I just printed on my printer, if I were to turn the light tablet on and I wanted to trace this just this size, it makes it really easy. And one thing I like to do, and this is just a sheet of tracing paper, is you can pull out your permanent marker, and this can help you simplify your scene down as well. And I'll often just use a permanent marker, and I'll start looking for those strong points of interest. With this tracing paper over top, I'm actually seeing some very strong darks. In here we've got the building, a big patch of light where the roof is, and I can just start to simplify my scene. I'm not going to see the lettering here, but this really is going to help me to simplify and break down my reference image as I think about how I want to paint it. As an artist, I'm an artist who likes to simplify. I don't want to paint every realistic detail. When I saw this scene and when I was driven to photograph it, when I had an idea that I might want to paint this in the future, it wasn't because I liked because I was studying every detail. It was the overall collection of shapes that I was drawn to. It was kind of that the dark patches where the paint had worn off around the lettering. And I mean, I guess I did read what it said because I would like to read, and when we see writing, our brains instantly want to figure out what it says. But when I take my tracing paper and I start to simplify, I can break it down to those overall shapes. I can also use that tracing paper to help me see the lines of perspective in my landscape. For this particular landscape, we really see just kind of a partial outline of the mountains. So maybe I'm just going to sketch just what I see by tracing. I see this big mass of trees as one shape. I see horizontal lines, and in landscapes there's often those horizontals, and I want to catch those. there's a little diagonal there, and that's going to be interesting to see. It's interesting to see what shows through. What we see with tracing paper are the areas of greatest contrast. And I think that's all I'm getting out of this. There's a little white line here. And so suddenly I've simplified my scene. And I really like being able to simplify also my tracing paper bled through onto my photos, so that's interesting. But I like being able to simplify because we zero in on our scene. And if you photographed, you know, this little old motel, and suddenly you're caught up in painting all the little vents on the air conditioning unit. And there's a little wire over here. And I spent quite a lot of time drawing and shading that little wire. But when I was sitting in my car looking at this area, I was not thinking about how much I wanted to paint that little wire and those vents on the air conditioner. I was struck by the overall content, and I need to focus on that. That's why we want to simplify and be able to observe. Looking for those strong areas of contrast really helps me. The light tablet I really like because it is actually bright enough to shine through 300-pound watercolor paper. So if you've taken the time to do a sketch, it actually will help you transfer that sketch over. When I'm transferring a sketch, I want to keep it simple. I want it to be more like this than like that motel picture I showed you. And even though I'm drawing that motel drawing in very great detail, that's kind of a personal challenge. When I go to give that a try using it for a painting, I'm going to take that drawing and create something more like this on my watercolor paper and see how it works to paint it like that. So I want you to think about that. We want to simplify. I want to detach from my subject. I want to, and that helps, rather than thinking, okay, I'm drawing this spruce tree in front of these Rocky Mountains, rather I want to say, I'm seeing this tall vertical, and then there's horizontals here, and I want to see how those fit together. And if you think of it as an abstract, we can build on that foundation and create stronger shapes without being focused on the tiny details in those early stages when we really should be focused on the major overall shapes. So in order to detach from my subject, to stop thinking about all the stuff in my picture and to think about how those elements work together and how I can make them work together to make a strong painting, I ask myself some questions. What if I painted this as an abstract? What would those shapes be? What would that collection of shapes and colors and patterns look like? I can try painting it that way. What if this object, this complicated thing that I'm trying to draw, was just a single shape instead of all the little bits and pieces and shadows and shades that I want to capture? It would be foolish of me to take my motel photograph and start drawing the F on the sign before I had anything else on my paper. Suddenly I've got this, and kids do this all the time. We get out of order. And so I see my letter F here. Oh, it's on this side. Everything's always backwards. So my letter F, if I drew that and then tried to fit the rest of the letters on, maybe I'd find out that I drew it too large and I'm falling off the page. Maybe I'd find out that maybe as I drew the F and then drew the R, everything's starting to slope downwards. You know, I lose accuracy. So I see the overall shape of actually the entire sign, and then I simplify to those, dividing it into those 3 different rectangles and then finding the shapes within that. I like to ask myself, what if I could only draw my scene in standard shapes? Instead of seeing the complexity of the subtleties of the way this shape has evolved, let's just see it as a vague, as an approximate rectangle. Let's start there. I noticed I drew birds better when I started to see their bodies as the head was more of a circle, and then the body was like an oval, and there was no neck. The circular head had to kind of sit nested into that oval shape of the body. And when I realized that, suddenly my birds, proportions of my birds became much better. We use NOTANs and value studies to help us to detach from our subject and simplify. And I want to show you that. We'll just switch over to my work surface here. Okay, so I have this painting. It's quite a detailed painting. Very clearly it's sun shining through trees. We've got rich dark shadows. But for me, this painting felt too detailed for what I wanted. I wanted something looser, something a little freer. And I ended up with this in my final version. And as you can see, it's very different than that original painting. I had to, and it was a multi-step process to get there. This is a value study that I did as part of that process, painting it in a single color. I think that's indigo. Trying to get that glow of the light coming through the trees, and also seeing what was the bare minimum that I could do to capture that feeling of light and shade and that just blast of sunlight coming through and breaking up those vertical tree shapes. It was a lot of fun to explore this process, and it wasn't without its missteps. And in fact, if you'll bear with me, I'll run and grab the other one that I did. It was not my intention to show them all to you, but I do have to show you this one because in this one I messed up. Again, it's gotten a little more detailed than I'd like, but you can see that the feeling of light is not what we're getting here. We're getting a feeling like somebody carved out a hole in these two stronger tree trunks. You know, so my tree trunks were too thick. And at this point, when I felt like I was kind of losing the plot, the thread of the narrative of what I was trying to say, that was when I went to the value study and worked on just trying to see light and dark, simplifying those shapes. This is learning to see, getting away from the detail to say what would it look like if it were simple. And you know, that for me is really what loose watercolor is all about, what intuitive painting is. When I get to the what would this look like if it were simple, I get to also think what would this look like if it were an Angela painting, and not just trying to accurately capture what my reference photo was telling me. This still has artistic license in it. You know, I chose the color palette, I simplified shapes even in this, but I still felt like I wanted something more from my painting, and I had to be willing to figure out what the heart of this scene was, and then learn how to get myself to give myself that ability to depict it. And the more I simplified, the better I was able to do that. Back to the notes here just for a second here. Another thing that I often do as a training to learn to see, like I said, we never sit there, we never look at a scene and you know, you want to paint your house and it's not because you were just in love with the shapes and the shadows on the proportions of all the drain pipes. You know, that's, or the eaves troughing or whatever. And yet we find ourselves obsessively painting in detail that doesn't have to be there. Let's work on learning to see the overall spirit of what we're seeing. What hit us with that first moment? Light through the trees. Okay, how do I get that feeling of light? And then everything else is a little bit optional. And that's a really fun thing to explore. We use value studies and NOTANs, and we'll be working with NOTANs in a future lesson. I also try to work with speed. The longer I spend on a painting, the more detail I'm going to feel obligated to put in. So I will often, when I've painted something that's quite detailed and controlled, I will often do a reactionary version where I try to paint it quickly with as few brush strokes as possible. What can I get away with? And it's really fun to see how much you can get away with when you simplify your scene. But you have to know what the strongest, what the message you want to have come across is. And it does take time to be able to do that. Another good way to learn is just to draw someone else's drawing because they've made the decisions. So if you're copying someone else's drawing, you can kind of see, it gives you that more opportunity to think through the decisions they made to create that object, that scene. And they've simplified it for you. And so you just get to kind of practice your mark making, your shapes, and see how they're positioned. You get to kind of analyze their work, which will strengthen your own. Something else you can do is a contour drawing. Take your pencil, draw the shapes of what you see without lifting your pencil. That can help you to see all the connections, all the shapes in your scene are connected to each other. They're connected, and we often try to paint each individual tree rather than seeing those trees as a mass. We try to, if we've got a foreground with a lot of detail, we try to paint all of that detail instead of looking for ways to simplify. We learn to see, and this is the good news, we learn to see as we try new things and work to simplify our subject. I am a better drawer, even though I rarely draw, because painting has taught me how to see. One thing that inspired this course, this series of lessons, was the other day I was walking with my dog and the wind was blowing just a little bit and the water was running in the ditches. And I was trying to figure out, I was thinking about painting water, and I was trying to see what color the water was. And it was rippling, the wind was blowing, and there was just little rivulets flowing through that ditch, and I couldn't really tell what color the water was. It was beige and it was blue. And so I took a picture of it with my camera, and the camera froze those little rivulets. And so I didn't see what the camera captured, just one of those moments. Suddenly it froze the scene. And so in my reference photo, in the photo I took, I can see the reflection of the trees as clear as crystal. And yet when I was standing there with the wind blowing, those reflections were broken up by the ripple in the water. The camera caught that moment just as everything was smooth before that next ripple came along, and it just looked completely different. And so it helped me to recognize that things are always changing, that what I see isn't always what I saw, what I see in my reference photo. And it really challenged me to continue to study what's around me, study what I'm seeing, and understand that it changes all the time. I don't know, that was powerful for me. We're going to be talking about painting water next week. That's our first lesson, is painting water. I don't know if that's a too complicated place to start, but I think water is a really great example of something that we often feel challenged to paint, something that I often get asked to teach me how to paint water. And so we'll talk about how we can apply our observation skills and then get our impression of water down on paper. I have a feeling this series of lessons is going to stretch me in a lot of ways. Okay, so I see that there's some talk about the Fibonacci spirals. Those line up with the golden mean, which is an article I've linked in the description. It's like a mind-blowing kind of topic, and one that I don't want you to be scared of. It's got some great information on composition, on patterns and shapes found in nature, and what we find visually pleasing, but you do not need to feel like this is something you have to be academic or legalistic about as you think about how that might affect how you paint. It's just something to be aware of, that these are techniques you can use to strengthen your composition skills. And I'm not very mathy, but I think it's just so fascinating how mathematics actually plays a role in not just in nature, yes, but in painting. It's just crazy. I'm just taking a look at some more questions here. I do just want to encourage you too. This is a lifelong practice. I am going to spend the rest of my life looking at the world and trying to figure out how to paint it, how to paint what I see. And every painting is an experiment and another step in that process. It's not you never arrive, but it's endlessly fascinating. And I think the key is found in learning to simplify, and we're just going to keep coming back there as we go through this series. I do have, I was going to show you some books before we stop. This is, Yes, I have some great books that I want to show you and talk about a little bit. In case you're looking for inspiration to help you simplify, to help you understand drawing and how it applies to painting. Okay, first of all, this is not a painting book. This one is called Drawing Perspective, How to See It and How to Apply It. And I just recently bought this book. I bought it this year. And I'm not good with perspective, first of all. And I don't know if I have to be. I think I get a little better at it all the time. But my goal for this book for me is to read, maybe 2 pages every week or 2 and just take really small bite-sized proportions, because I don't want to get lost in line. I am not a person who wants to sketch like this with all those lines and feel, like I have to get that perspective spot on. But I do kind of want to understand how shapes change as they move away from us, how objects fit into the landscape, and how buildings kind of fit together when we're painting maybe an urban scene or a street scene. And one thing I like about this book is it has a lot of different artists' work in it, and I always enjoy that when it comes to topical work. There's quite a lot of watercolor because there's a lot of urban sketching in here. Which reminds me, okay, and that was written by Matthew Brem, Drawing Perspective, How to See It and How to Apply It. I will put all of these links in the description below the video once our class wraps up today. This is Mark Taro Holmes' Urban Sketcher book. I have a bunch of his books. He's written, I think, 4 or 5. This one is really interesting for kind of simplifying sketching. I really felt, especially after meeting Mark, he's not a snob about his sketching. He's taught himself, and he's just been persistent in learning different strategies that help him to paint on location. And he is a watercolorist. And so, yeah, this is a really enjoyable book for just observing how he uses sketches. Back here, he does talk about how he develops them into a painting. And look at this. He's used the roof lines as a mountain range and then created beautiful patterns in here that fill out this scene. And that's just as simple as it is. So just an enjoyable book and simplifying the process. My friend Charlie O'Shields made this sketching stuff activity book. You can work right in this book, and Charlie has become a very talented watercolor and ink sketcher just by sketching every single day, and he's done that for quite a few years, and I've loved watching his journey and seeing how he gets better at it gets better just by playing, being very childlike about his approach. And you can feel that there's just a lot of fun in this scene. In this one, he's got his reference photo. He's got a partially begun drawing that you can then add to. So lots of different things, and it makes it very approachable. It's like a coloring book in many ways, but it's created for you to sketch and paint right in. This one, Playing with Sketching. This is not, or Playing with Sketches by Whitney Sherman. This one is Creative Exercises for Designers and Artists. This one gives you, I bought this because I wanted to do the activities with my junior high school students when I was teaching art in my kids' school, because it does so many little fun activities to make drawing feel playful, to let you draw from the imagination. This is self-portraits using your non-dominant hand, sketching found objects, learning how to make pattern, using sticky notes to make a quilt. How fun is that? I love anything that helps me to draw by making drawing feel fun, making it less intimidating, just exercising your motor skills. And then finally, this is Felix Scheinberger's Dare to Sketch. I saved this one for last because I like it so much. His sketches in many ways can often feel kind of ugly or garish. And I like that. It makes me happy because he makes it just so approachable. Here's a shopping cart. Keep it simple. You're growing your observation skills. You're freeing yourself from the expectation that your drawing has to be beautiful. You can see his watercolor sketch here is very, very, very loose, very splashy, and simplified. And so this book makes me feel like urban sketching is something that I can do. And yet he's good. He just has a gift for capturing his scene and doing it in the simplest way possible. And I think that's really powerful. So yeah, the last one was Felix Scheinberger's Dare to Sketch. And again, I will link those up in the description below the video with some Amazon links so that if you want to order those, often they're ebooks, so you can use, you can download them and test them out before you buy them. I do that fairly often. There are a lot of really great books out there. That's just a few that I have that have encouraged me. And I want to feel encouraged. I don't want to feel overwhelmed by this process of learning to see, learning to translate what I see onto paper. I don't need to be intimidated by people who sketch with extreme accuracy. And that's not what my painting needs. My painting needs somebody who can use a visual shorthand to get what we see down onto paper. And so whether I'm using a pencil or whether I'm using my brush, and that's what we want to explore in this series. So I hope you'll stick with us as we cover those in the next few weeks. I don't know, it might take years, but we're going to just learn to, continue to view our world through the framework, the perspective of an artist. How would I paint that? How do I get that image that struck me so much without losing sight of the essence of it? I don't want to get caught up in details so that I lose, that heart of what I wanted to capture. And I think it takes time and playfulness and just being really patient with the process. Okay. Any questions here? Yeah, Jackie says math plays an important role in music also. I think that's so funny. My daughter's a pianist, and so she was telling me about fifths and sevenths, and my eyes just kind of glazed over. I just like pretty music. And yet, the small amounts of information we take in, those little bite-sized chunks, they can have a really powerful and long-term impact on our art. We're filling a toolbox, but if you filled it with all the tools today, you wouldn't know which one to pick when you would next go to paint. So we just need to add one little piece today, and then tomorrow something new might come along, or we learn to use that new tool better. And so we want to be good to ourselves in that process. So thank you for joining me today. Next week we'll be talking about painting water. And I'm going to go drink some water and add those links to the description below the video. Come back in about 15 minutes and I'll have those there if you'd like to source any of those books that I've talked about. I'll see you next week, and bye for now.